It was meant to be an ordinary day at work for one Australian fisherman. He didn't expect to haul a body back to port. This is the murder of the Rack Man. Let's step into the cold. 11th of August 1994. Around noon that day, fisherman Mark Peterson began steering his boat, the Lady Marian, back to port. He'd travelled up Sydney's Hawkesbury River to a point just past Challenger Head to catch squid. When he felt a tug on his net, he was pleased, as the catch was heavy. When he arrived back at port, he began going through the process of pulling the net onto the deck of his boat. But what Mark found in the net wasn't squid. Attached to the net was a large steel cross. Puzzled, Mark looked at the frame more closely. Several plastic bags had been attached to the frame. Sticking out of one of the bags was a bone. Then Mark began to see several more bones. Having no way of knowing if the bones were animal or human, Mark called the Broken Bay Water Police. The police escorted the Lady Marian to Patonga Wharf. An officer who regularly dealt with physical evidence made a cursory examination of the find. She classified the bones as human. Glebe is a suburb of Sydney and is located southwest of the central area of the city. Once the bones had been classified as human, the bones and the frame were taken to the New South Wales Institute of Forensic Medicine, located in Glebe. Forensic pathologist Dr. Chris Lawrence examined the find the next day. He noted that the bones on the frame had been arranged in an anatomical way. From the skull, Dr. Lawrence determined that the remains belonged to a dark-haired Caucasian man. He would have been between 21 and 46 years old. The man's left femur was 42.8 centimeters long, and his left radius was 22.2 centimeters long. These measurements allowed Dr. Lawrence to work out the dead man's height. He would have stood between 5'2" and 5'4" tall. Soft tissue was present on the remains, as was adiposery. Adiposery is sometimes referred to as grave wax, and is a substance that forms underwater. It preserves a person's shape or features. Fingerprints could not be recovered, and the DNA extracted from the remains was of too poor quality to be able to identify the man. Forensic odontologist Dr. Chris Griffiths examined the man's skull and teeth. The man had no fillings, and his first lower right molar had been removed, likely when he was young. Dr. Griffiths concluded that the man's face might have been slightly misshapen. Silvana Tridico, a forensic biologist and a specialist hair examiner from the Forensic Science Centre in Adelaide, studied the man's hair. Tridico agreed that the man appeared to be Caucasian, and added that he may have been of Mediterranean or Central European origin. Clothing was present when the man was found. He wore a medium-sized polo shirt with the label "Everything Australian." The shirt's manufacturer was tracked down, and with the help of the company's operations manager, investigators found that the logo on the shirt's tag was used between 1982 and 1987. During that time period, the company had roughly 23 stores in Australia, with many located in New South Wales, where Sydney is, and Queensland. The man had also been wearing a pair of blue and white striped underwear from the brand Sparrow. The underwear had been measured to fit an 85-centimetre waist. Over the underwear, the man had been wearing large dark-coloured tracksuit pants, labelled "No Sweat". Found in the left pocket was a pack of Benson and Hedges cigarettes and a pink lighter. But it was clear to investigators that something sinister had happened to the wreck man. It wasn't as if the man had accidentally drowned and his clothing had snagged on the steel frame. The man's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and he had been tied to a frame that had been custom built just for him. Someone had wanted the man dead, and they didn't want his body to be found. Dr. Lawrence wasn't able to determine if the man was dead before he was attached to the frame, which weighed 43 kilograms. The frame had been made from a 1.82 metre length of flat metal. 2 cylindrical metal bars had been welded onto the piece of flat metal. Between the 2 cylindrical bars, 2 pieces of reinforcing rod had been attached and bent into a restrictive L shape over the body. The wreck man's body was wrapped in black plastic, and 2 plastic bags had been used to cover his head. Orange rope had been tied around the neck in a non-slip knot. The body was then attached to the frame with rope, and wire was then wrapped around the neck and torso. The frame and the body was then dumped into the water. Emeritus Professor Donald Anderson from the University of Sydney studied 2 barnacles removed from the frame to assess their growth rate. This would allow him to assess how long the frame had been submerged for, and he concluded that the frame had been underwater for less than a year, although a longer time frame couldn't be ruled out. Due to the way the body was dumped, police believe that the victim was involved in organised crime. Detective Chief Inspector John Lehman of the New South Wales Unsolved Homicide Team summed things up perfectly when he said, "I would say as an investigator that it's an unusual way to dispose of a person." Guided by the knowledge of forensic anthropologist Dr. Denise Donlan, forensic anatomist Maya Sutisno created a facial reconstruction of the victim's skull. Computer-enhanced images of what the victim may have looked like were handed out among investigators. Both the facial reconstruction and the computer-enhanced images were shown in the media and on the TV show Australia's Most Wanted. 32 phone calls from the public were received. The police now had potential identities to look into. A member of the public suggested that the rack man may have been Joe BIVIANO, a convicted drug dealer. He was 30 years old when he vanished, had dark hair, and looked to be of Mediterranean appearance. He was last seen in the Sydney suburb of Drummoyne in December 1993 as he made his way to a party. As investigators couldn't find Joe's dental records, a DNA sample was taken from a relative. Tests were unable to match the sample to the remains, and Joe was ruled out as a potential victim. The police looked into the possibility that the victim may have been Peter MITRIS, a Greek businessman who disappeared in the King's Cross area of Sydney in April 1991. In the past, the police had been given information that said Peter had been bashed to death and dumped in the ocean off Sydney. However, at 5'10", he was too tall to be the victim, and according to his sister, Peter's crooked teeth didn't look anything like those belonging to the victim. Christopher Dale Flannery, an alleged hitman also known as Mr. Rent-A-Kill, has also been suggested as a possible identity. He disappeared in May 1985, but his dental records didn't match the Rackman. Stephen Bryant, a man who went missing in 1993, was also looked into as a possible identity of the victim. He had been due to spend Christmas 1993 with his friends James and Christine Nissen in Tukabia, near Grafton in New South Wales. He never showed up. The police theorised that Stephen may have been involved in a drug rip-off that led to his death. None of the evidence the police had suggested he was the Rackman. Matt Tensevsky was the final man ruled out as being the man on the rack. He was a gambler who was last seen in January 1993 at Newtown, located in Sydney's inner west. He had $1,800 in cash on him when he disappeared, but this wasn't unusual. Matt would often withdraw large sums of money from the bank. He would travel the Gold Coast while gambling, but would always return home after a few days. No evidence proved that Matt was the victim. A $100,000 reward is available for information leading to the identification of the man on the rack and arrest and conviction of those responsible. The man's remains still remain at the morgue in Glebe, where they are known as Unknown Bones E48293. In an interview, Detective Chief Inspector John Lehman reminded police that it's not just the victim who suffers when a murder happens. He said, "Whoever this person is, he's someone's son or husband or brother, and it's not just the actual victims of homicide who suffer, it's their families. There is more than one victim." And in another interview, Detective Sergeant Gary Williams of the Major Crime Squad summarised this most curious of cases when he said, "It's been a time-consuming exercise, one of the most baffling cases I've ever confronted."